All right, worship. As we start this next ministry cycle, we've had 3 of them: trusting in God, hoping in God, and exalting God. And as we talked about trusting in God, we talked about the God that's knowable, who has revealed himself, the God who is sovereign. We talked about hope, and now we're talking about exalting God. But the question should be, what does that mean? What does it mean to exalt God? And in the email I sent out, I asked the question, does this mean, or in some way implied, that God's got a tender ego and he just always needs to be encouraged and boosted up? What does it mean? This is one of those theological words in our Bibles, in the English translation, the word worship, the word exalt, where the tradition has been to take words that have a very specific meaning in their original context and translate all of those words by a single word, the word worship or the word exalt. But if we look back at the context, especially in the Old Testament, on how the words that are translated worship were used in the environment and context and culture of the day, it helps us articulate better, understand better what it is when we say we are going to worship God. We are going to exalt God. So we are going to break it down into 3 concepts of what worship includes. And this is obviously not exhaustive, but I think this helps us articulate better when we say we're going to worship what it is we're doing exactly. So here are the 3 concepts. Today we're looking at Psalm 97, which is a royal psalm about the king and focuses on allegiance to God. The next one, next week's a Communion Sunday. Week after that, we will look at awareness from Nehemiah 9 and Psalm 24, being aware of who God is, that life is lived in his presence. And then in a couple of weeks, Psalm 99, attribution to God, in acknowledgement of who he is. And these 3 ideas come together to form or to define for us what it means to worship God, what it means to exalt God. Now, I'm just going to do a little sidebar here. You remember, maybe I should pull one of these wooden things up and stand on it as my soapbox. You remember I used to do these back in the day, rants about things. Well, this is sort of a self-deprecating rant, because this is an issue. The whole concept of worship is an issue that pushes my button because it is so misused in especially evangelicalism. And there is a understanding or a consensus that when we talk about worship, we're talking primarily about music. And we're going to sing, and that's worship. And that is not a biblical concept. And it gets me riled up. So I'm going to need you all together to hold me accountable that I don't get on my little hobby horse and start whacking on this thing, because it really, really bugs me. It's not a biblical concept. That's why we do not refer to, when we sing, inviting Paul and LaFay to come up and lead us in worship. We have been worshiping. From the moment we engage with one another, we are worshiping. From the moment we wake up, we are worshiping the Creator God, or we should be, because worship encompasses, saturates all of life. When we sit around and have coffee, I'm not trying to be cute when I say we're going to worship with coffee and snacks, because it's relational, it's fellowship, that's worship. When we take the offering, although we don't make a big deal of that here, but when we are being faithful stewards of the resources God's given us, we are worshiping. Okay, take this box away before I get... Allegiance. The word worship in English is sourced out of, and the word exalt, is sourced out of a group of words, especially out of the Old Testament, that come from the context of engagement with royalty, your response to the king. And as we're going to see, that response, the words that make up that vocabulary set, direct us into a different perspective than simply saying we're going to sing about God. And in Psalm 97, this is a royal psalm, and as I've mentioned several times in the past, The ancient worshipers, those who were going to sing this, would recognize immediately what kind of psalm it was because of the style and the structure of the psalm. And they would understand as soon as this, whatever the music was that accompanied this, or when somebody started to quote it, it had a certain style to it that they would recognize, oh, we are talking about the king. We're talking about the king. And unlike some other types of psalms, there is no formal structure to royal psalms. A lament psalm, for example, it has a confessional statement and an expression of trust and a resolution. There's some very clear patterns. Royal psalms are not like that. However, they do have movement. And they are intended to take the worshiper from this point of agreeing with a general statement through a process of acknowledging who this God is and coming out at the end with an exaltation or confession because he is the king. And that is what worship is about. So it starts in verse 1, Psalm 97, verse 1. It starts with this introductory statement, which is really an invitation for those who are within earshot of the psalmist to join him in celebrating and exalting this God who is the creator of heaven and earth. And notice how it says the Lord, again, in all caps, Yahweh, the covenant God, who made a special relationship with Israel. The Lord reigns. Let the earth rejoice. Everything in the earth. Let the many coastlands be glad. We should be excited. This should evoke not just an intellectual response, but an emotional response. And we struggle to keep that balance. People like me, I tend to be much more cerebral. I don't get off on trying to hype everything. And that can be, for Bill, a cure for insomnia. Other people are very animated and extroverted, and they can just woo the crowd and move people to tears and to laughter. Well, there's both. God's made us emotional and intellectual beings, so we need both. The Lord reigns, let the earth rejoice, let the many coastlands be glad. And this idea of rejoicing is repeated in verse 12. There is an emotive response to the fact that God is the creator, but there's also a volitional and a mindful response to, so what does that mean? How do we react to this God? Do we simply hype ourselves up so we feel good, we have an experience, or is there something else going on? So the psalmist breaks his exhortation, his encouragement to worship, into three target groups. The first one is looking at all of creation, the world in general, in verses 2 to 6. We should rejoice and we should be glad because all of the natural world is subject to the authority of the king and demonstrates his authority. It's not simply, no, he is engaged and he engages with what he has created, and the effects of that engagement can be seen. Now, this is a poem. This is a song. So it's going to use some very creative elements. But nonetheless, the point is that God is engaged in his creation. Verse 2, clouds and thick darkness are all around him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. Fire goes up before him and burns his adversaries all around. His lightnings light up the world. The earth sees and trembles. The mountains melt like wax before the Lord of all the earth. The heavens proclaim his righteousness, and all the peoples see his glory. So it's not just that he can control the natural elements, but he is controlling it so the righteous and the unrighteous are subject to his authority. And in such a way that the mountains melt. Now, this is metaphorical language. The point is that God's reign is engaged in the creation which he has made. This created order continues to be subject to his authority and everything in it. We'll see that in more detail when we come to Nehemiah 9 and Psalm 24 in just a couple of weeks. The heavens declare his righteousness, and all the peoples see his glory. Again, a poetic statement, because you look around today, you hear what happened in Grimsby just the other day at Harmony Jewelers again, and it's like, where's the righteousness? Where's the glory? So this is a poetic statement about the nature of God and his engagement, not necessarily that all of that is happening now. It will happen. That's the source of our hope. But for now, his authority is over all the world. Even the natural world is subject to him. Now this, being familiar with the New Testament and the great texts about Jesus and his coming and being creator, this may not seem that significant to us. But we have to put ourselves back into those early centuries and into the dynamic of ancient Israel and their culture and the nations all around Israel who worshiped multiple gods. And they had this understanding that the world, what was happening in the world, was a direct reflection of what was happening amongst the multitude, a pantheon of gods that were up there, disinterested in what was happening down here, except when they needed or wanted something. The story of Elijah is a great example of that, Elijah confronting the prophets of Baal. So the elements of nature were play tools for the pagan gods. This is the worldview. Now, there are no pagan gods. There is only one God, right? But as they understood that there were these deities up there, the natural world were their playthings. And yet the psalmist, in contrast to that, is saying, the mountains melt, the lightning flashes, because God is on his throne, not because the deities are fighting with one another. God needs no help. There's not a committee of multiple deities up there arguing with one another, trying to control the forces of nature. Rather, God is demonstrating his authority because he has authority and all the forces of nature are subject to him. God is to be worshiped because he is the creator Lord. And we go, yeah, of course. But if you're an Israelite and you're just living in this environment without the benefit of all the revelation that's to come and understanding of Jesus, and all you have is the story of the Exodus and some of these Psalms that are being written, this is mind-blowing. This is changing your worldview completely, that the harvest and the drought and famine and locusts and everything that happens is not because there are unknowable spiritual entities up there wreaking havoc with us. It's because there is a creator God who is doing something according to a bigger plan. So this is a very strong argument for the Israelites to teach them, do not worship the other gods, but worship the one true God. And we'll get to that in the very next section, starting in verse 7. Not only is all of the natural world subject to him, but as this was in their mindset, in the contemporary culture mindset of that day, what was happening in the natural world was a reflection of the deities playing with one another. The idolaters, those who worship these false gods, and these imaginary gods who don't really exist, it's a figment of the imagination, are also subject to this creator God. Verses 7 to 9. Verse 7. All worshipers of images are put to shame, who make their boast in worthless idols. Worship him, all you gods. Zion hears and is glad because the daughters of Judah rejoice because of your judgments, O Lord. For you, O Lord, are most high over all the earth. You are exalted far above all gods. And in this middle section of the psalm, we have a variety of words that are taken out of the context of the royal court, what it means to honor the king, and put into the context of worship, all translated worship or exalt in our English text, but that's not what they mean. Verse 7, all worshipers of images are put to shame. That word worshiper means all those who serve, all those who have allegiance to an idol or a pagan god will be put to shame. And it's the same word that's used when the warnings were given to Israel, that when you go into the promised land, do not bow down to their gods and serve them. Do not serve the other gods. It's unfortunate it's translated worshipers. It should be all those who serve these images are put to shame. In other words, the entire worldview, their structure of their life is ordered by an allegiance to a God who doesn't exist. They serve him. And they make their boast in worthless idols. Very next line in verse 7 at the end. Worship him, all you gods. That is, worship Yahweh. It's a different word in the Hebrew. This is the word to bow down before. And that's why the image is of a gentleman here on his knee. Bow down. You serve him just as if you were in the royal court, you would serve the king. You're a servant of the king. And you bow down, you show reverence and respect. This is another component for worship, unfortunately translated by the same word in English. But two ideas here. We are serving Yahweh, we bow down to Yahweh, and it's tongue-in-cheek. So all you pagan gods that don't really exist, but for the sake of argument, let's say they do, you too need to bow down before the Creator of heaven and earth. Zion, or Jerusalem, hears and is glad, and the daughters of Judah rejoice. There's that word glad again that we saw earlier. Because of your judgments, O Lord. Why? Why are they glad? Why should all worshipers serve the one true God? Why should they bow down in reverence? Because you, O Lord, Yahweh, the covenantal God, are most high over all the earth, and you are exalted far above all gods. And the word exalted literally is the same word that's used of an offering, that the smoke would go up and be acceptable in the sight of God. You are the one that we raise our hands to, or we provide or sacrifice to. You are the one that we submit ourselves to, because you are far above all other gods who don't even really exist. So the psalmist is not saying these gods do exist. He's hypothetically speaking, if there were gods, our God is above all these gods. So the concept of serving, the concept of bowing down in submission and humility before, the concept of expressing the greatness and obedience to God. These are the core ideas that come out of the realm of the royal court that are translated in English as worship. But if only our Bible translators had used the actual words, it'd be so much clearer. So instead of saying we're going to come and sing and worship, we are going to come and we are going to lift up and expound the great qualities of our God in music together. Or we are going to commit ourselves to obeying God together, because that's what it means to worship. And then the last section, verses 10 to 12, people of God, the real people of God, celebrate him as they worship. Verse 10, O you who love the Lord, Yahweh, hate evil. He preserves the lives of his saints. He delivers them from the hand of the wicked. Light is sown for the righteous and joy for the upright in heart. Rejoice in the Lord, you righteous, and give thanks to his holy name. There's that word rejoice again. It's appeared 3 times now in this psalm. Celebrate the goodness of God. That's part of worship. That's the emotive part of expressing your heart of joy before him, but there's also the volitional part and the intellectual part where you are a servant to him. You bow down in reverence before him. You acknowledge his character and you are obedient. But these are all statements of authority, recognizing the authority of God and responding to him. And that's what worship is. It's acknowledging who he is and his authority and responding appropriately. And the psalmist takes language directly out of the royal court of what it meant to be subject to a king, any king. These words were not special words made up by the religious musicians of the day to create a vocabulary. They were borrowed from the world around them to acknowledge the authority of a king and to respond appropriately. So how do we rejoice? How do we give thanks? How do we hate evil, as we are encouraged in the last part of this psalm? Well, if we put these ideas together, commonly translated worship in our English Bibles, we're talking about an attitude or a commitment to serve God, to be subject to him, to humble ourselves before him, to speak well of him, that's what it means to exalt him, to speak well of him, to represent well the living God. And that's part of where you hear me say over and over again, part of what we do at Q50 is learning the skills on how to represent Christ well. That's what it means to glorify God. That's what it means to worship him, to represent him well. We can do that easily here and this, because we're all of the same ilk, and this is a comfortable place to be. But when we're out there engaging with people who have different values, who hold a different sense of humor than we do, that drive their cars differently, that use their money differently, how do we represent Christ well? That is as much a part of worship as the event of being together in this room as the community of faith. Worship is not a ritual in which we enter on a weekly basis. It is not a ceremony or music. It is the integration of faith in God in every dynamic of our relationships and expressions in life, that we verbalize and confess our faith in God. And we don't have to do that by saying, oh, I'm not going to laugh at your joke because I'm a Christian. That was dirty. No, it's having the skill to represent Christ well by being people of integrity and being able to walk through those difficult conversations and still maintain our loyalty to the Creator God. In the mind of this psalmist, worship is about consistent loyalty to the King and his kingdom in every sphere of life. The natural world is subject to his authority. The false gods are subject to his authority, and they don't even exist, yet they're subject to his authority. And we too, worshipers that rejoice and give thanks, are subject to his authority because he holds reign over everything. What's really interesting, though, is that this word to serve, which is there in verse 7, the psalmist chooses a word not only from the royal courts, but it goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. And in Genesis chapter 2, in the creation story, this is why understanding the God who's creator of heaven and earth, this idea of creation theology is so important, that God is the source of all things and all things are subject to him. In Genesis chapter 2, when there was no bush in the field, or when no bush was in the field was in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord had not caused it to rain on the land. Why? Because there is no man to work the ground. It's the same word translated worship. Because working for God is a form of worship. It's why we're created. That's part of being an image bearer. Recognizing that the tasks that we do is one way that we worship God. And then 10 verses later, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. That was his function as an image bearer, to care for God's creation. That's what it means to worship God. But even more interesting is the same guy who wrote that and tells the creation story using this word here, translated work, in the Psalms, translated worship, the same word, writes this in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12. Now Israel, what does the Lord require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, and to serve, to work for him with all your heart, with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. Behold, to the Lord your God belong the heavens and the heaven of the heavens and the earth and all that is in it. Where have we seen that? Psalm 97. So Psalm 97 is based on this understanding of God as creator has placed us here to serve him, to work for him, that all that we do is a service to God, and that is worship. Not just having an experience on a Sunday morning where we raise our hands or we're overwhelmed by the environment that we create with sound and lights and whatever other factors we want to bring. And there's a time and place for that. I'm not against that. I recognize we're created emotive beings and we need to have that emotional engagement. But that alone is not worship, yet that's the predominant definition. It's not about music. It's about service. It's about humility. It's about being subject to God in every part of life. And that's why in our next part, we're going to talk about awareness, worshiping God as being aware of his engagement in all of life. To worship God, to exalt God, is an expression of allegiance to God. And that's also what it means to be holy. Holiness is the commitment of loyalty to the kingdom of God. And this is the language that comes out of royalty, out of palaces, out of thrones, out of high places of authority, all of which in the images we may conjure up in our minds of human expressions of that, Buckingham Palace or whatever it may be, all of which are occupied by God himself and God alone. And that's why the Apostle Paul encourages us to pray for our leaders and to be subject to them, for there is no authority established apart from that which God has established, because he is the source of all authority. He created it. He has authority over it in everything. It is all God's. And worshiping God is changing our mindset from being that thing we do once a week to seeing and discovering the fingerprints of his control, of his authority, of his grace in every dimension, and being faithful to represent him and to show others that my perspective on this is a little bit different, because I believe there's a God in heaven who holds authority over all things, and I worship him. I am subject to him. I serve him, and I will represent him well because I exalt him. That is worship. That is how, part one, we exalt God, by recognizing our allegiance and confessing our allegiance to him in the everyday, not simply by singing a few songs on a Sunday morning. I could go on, but I better stop here, because you just get me wound up, and then Sharon's got to take me home and live with me the rest of the week. So let me pray.